The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as Marcus Dre, the young CEO of an innovative tech company, sat at the defendant's table. The judge, an older man with a reputation for being tough on corporate defendants, flipped through the legal documents in front of him, a smirk playing on his lips. The prosecution was confident that today would be a clear victory, and Dre could already feel the weight of the accusations piling up against him. "Mr. Dre," the judge finally said, looking over his glasses, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I hope you're ready to explain why you think you can operate outside the boundaries of the law." The room was filled with laughter. Dre, however, remained calm, sitting with his hands folded in front of him, his gaze steady. The prosecutor stood confidently and addressed the jury, eager to lay out his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, his voice sharp and commanding, "we are here today because a billionaire thinks he can break the law. Marcus Dre's company has knowingly violated regulations, disregarded industry standards, and flaunted the rules. Today, we will prove that Mr. Dre's defiance has crossed the line." The judge leaned forward, his expression a mix of amusement and suspicion. "Mr. Dre, do you understand the severity of the accusations against you?" he asked. Dre didn't respond immediately. He merely tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating the question. The room waited for him to speak, the tension building. The prosecutor didn't wait long to continue. "This is not a simple case of corporate mismanagement," he said, flipping through his documents dramatically. "This is a textbook case of corporate arrogance, ignoring laws that govern every other business, simply because Mr. Dre thinks he is above them." Dre's eyes narrowed, his expression still unreadable. The prosecutor continued, convinced of his triumph. "Your Honor, this case is clear. My opponent has made a career of pushing boundaries. But today, we'll see that there are lines even he cannot cross." The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes twinkling with amusement. "Mr. Dre, are you planning to defend yourself? Or do we need to explain legal terms to you?" The courtroom chuckled, and the prosecutor looked smug, convinced of an easy win. But Dre, still calm, stood up slowly, straightening his jacket. His silence had made the tension in the room palpable. The gallery fell silent. This was the moment they had been waiting for. "Your Honor," Dre said, his voice steady but with an edge of authority, "I would like to thank the prosecution for their very dramatic interpretation of events. However, it seems they have overlooked one very important detail." He paused for effect. "I didn't break the law. In fact, my company has always acted within the legal framework that was in place at the time. What I am here to argue today is not that the law doesn't matter, but that the law is changing, and it's being applied to past actions in a way that simply isn't fair." The room was silent, the words hanging in the air. Dre's expression remained calm as he continued. "The company I founded followed all the rules that existed when I started. We were fully compliant with the laws in place at the time. The problem is that the laws have since changed, and now we are being told that actions that were perfectly legal are suddenly violations of new laws that weren't even on the books when those actions were taken." The prosecutor's smirk faltered. Dre's words had struck a nerve, and the room shifted from a sense of certainty to uncertainty. Dre wasn't just defending himself, he was beginning to challenge the entire premise of the case. The courtroom was tense. Every eye in the room focused on Marcus Dre as he prepared to respond. The prosecution had outlined their case, accusing his company of violating regulations. They had focused heavily on the company's past financial records, sensitive data that they claimed showed clear violations of the new laws. But Dre knew that the records in question were from a time when the legal framework was entirely different. "Your Honor," Dre began, his voice steady, "what we are really discussing today isn't whether my company broke the law. It's about whether it's fair to judge actions taken under a different legal system, before the new laws were even in place." He paused, his gaze steady as he looked toward the judge and then the jury. "The financial records the prosecution is using to accuse us of wrongdoing were created before the Clean Energy Act. The law they are now holding us accountable to was even passed. These records reflect actions and business decisions that were made in full compliance with the laws that existed at that time. At the time, those actions were not only legal, they were encouraged by the existing regulatory environment." Dre took a breath, making sure his words were sinking in. "So, how can it be fair to use these old records, made under different rules, to accuse us of violations today? We're not being judged for what we did wrong under the current law. We're being judged for actions that were fully legal when they were taken, based on laws that no longer apply." The room was silent, the seriousness of Dre's point sinking in. The prosecutor, still confident, shuffled through his papers to maintain his grip on the case. Dre continued, now addressing both the judge and the prosecutor directly. "I'm not saying that the law doesn't need to change. Of course, laws evolve, but what I'm saying is that we cannot and should not be penalized for actions that were perfectly legal at the time they were taken. These records, which the prosecution is using to argue violations, are nothing more than a snapshot of the business environment that existed before these new regulations came into play." He motioned toward the stack of financial documents presented earlier, the same records being scrutinized. These records were produced under a legal framework that no longer exists. They reflect business decisions, product pricing, and contracts that were all fully within the bounds of the law at the time. But now, the prosecution wants to punish us for those decisions under a new set of laws that we had no way of knowing would exist when those records were created. Dre's voice grew firmer. It's not just about the records themselves. It's about the principle that laws should not be applied retroactively to punish companies for following the law as it was written when they made their decisions. The prosecutor, now a bit rattled, interrupted, trying to regain control. "Mr. Dre, the law has changed, and that doesn't absolve you. These records are evidence of violations. Plain and simple." Dre turned to the prosecutor, a calm but unwavering look in his eyes. "It's not about absolution. It's about fairness. My company has updated its practices to comply with the new laws. And we've made sure that everything we do now aligns with the new regulations. But to punish us for actions that were fully legal at the time, based on a set of laws that no longer apply, is not just unfair, it's unjust." He faced the judge again. "Your Honor, we are asking for fairness. These financial records are not evidence of wrongdoing under the new regulations. They are evidence of decisions made under the old legal framework. And the question is whether it is fair to use them to accuse us of violations of a law that didn't even exist at the time." The judge, thoughtful, adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on Dre as the weight of his argument settled in. He nodded slowly. "I understand your point, Mr. Dre. We will need to consider the implications of using these records under the new law carefully." Dre stood tall, his argument made. He hadn't just defended his company's actions, he had called into question the very fairness of applying new laws to old records. He had made it clear that the issue wasn't whether the law had changed, it was whether it was right to punish actions that were legal at the time they were made. The courtroom had grown quieter since Dre's powerful argument, and the judge was leaning forward, deep in thought. The prosecutor, who had initially been so confident, was now visibly rattled, flipping through his documents in search of something that could refute Dre's defense. Dre's words had struck a nerve. Not only had he questioned the fairness of applying the new regulations to actions that were legal at the time, but he had also made the case that the integrity of the legal system itself was at stake. The issue wasn't about violating the law. It was about ensuring that laws applied to business operations were just and reasonable, and not applied retroactively in a way that could harm businesses that had been acting in good faith. The silence in the room stretched on, and finally, the judge spoke, his voice serious and measured. "Mr. Dre," he began, his gaze fixed on the defendant, "you make a compelling case. You have argued that the financial records in question reflect actions taken under a legal framework that no longer applies. However, this court must still determine whether or not your actions, as reflected in those records, violate the spirit of the law as it exists today." Dre's heart raced, but he maintained his composure. He had expected this response from the judge. His entire defense had been about showing the unfairness of applying new laws to old actions. But now he needed to ensure the court understood that his company had already adjusted to the new regulations. "Your Honor," Dre said, standing taller, "I understand the importance of applying the spirit of the law. But we must also acknowledge that laws are meant to be applied in a way that is consistent and predictable. If laws are allowed to change the rules of the game halfway through, if we apply them retroactively to punish companies for actions that were legal at the time, then we undermine the very purpose of a stable legal system. Companies should not live in fear of new regulations retroactively making their past decisions illegal. Dre paused, looking directly at the jury, his voice growing more impassioned. Since the new regulations were introduced, we have worked tirelessly to ensure that our practices comply with the new law. We updated our products. We reorganized our business processes. We did everything required to adapt to the law as it exists today. But it is simply not fair to retroactively apply those laws to decisions that were made when the legal framework was different. He turned back to the judge. The real issue here, Your Honor, is about whether we as a society want to create an environment where businesses are held accountable for doing things that were perfectly legal when they were done. And if we do, we risk destroying the trust that companies have in the legal system. The prosecutor stood up, attempting to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, signaling for him to sit down. We have heard your argument, Mr. Dre, the judge said, his tone stern but thoughtful. The court will now take some time to deliberate on the fairness of retroactively applying these laws to your company's actions. We will consider whether the intent of the law and the spirit of justice have been compromised in this case. Dre remained standing, his back straight, his eyes calm. He had said everything he needed to say. But the battle was far from over. The judge's words were measured, but the sense of uncertainty was palpable. Would the court side with him and accept the argument that applying the new law retroactively was unfair? Or would they rule that the letter of the law, regardless of the context in which the actions were taken, should apply? The room was tense as the judge signaled for a brief recess. The jury filed out, and Dre finally allowed himself a deep breath. He knew that the outcome of the case was still uncertain, but he had done everything he could to present a clear and compelling argument. Now, it was in the hands of the judge, and the legal system itself, to decide whether fairness or the rigidity of the law would prevail. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as the jury returned, the weight of their decision now looming over them. Dre sat still, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze focused. He had laid out his case with precision, presenting the contradictions between old and new laws. And now it was up to the jury and the judge to determine if fairness would prevail. The judge called the court to order. The room fell silent as everyone turned toward him. The prosecutor looked tense, his earlier confidence shaken by the powerful argument Dre had presented. The jury appeared thoughtful, exchanging looks but saying nothing. The decision was in the air. After careful consideration, the judge began, his voice steady. We have come to a decision. The tension in the room was palpable, and Dre could feel his heart racing as the judge continued. While it is clear that the defendant, Mr. Dre, has taken significant steps to comply with the new regulations, it is also clear that the actions in question were taken under a different legal framework. These actions were not violations at the time they were undertaken, and the application of the new law to these past actions is, in this case, unfair. Dre let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The prosecutor's face tightened, frustration evident, but the judge wasn't finished yet. However, the judge added, this ruling does not absolve Mr. Dre or his company from future scrutiny. The new regulations are in place, and the defendant must continue to adhere to them from this point forward. The law may have changed, but the expectation of compliance remains. The room remained quiet for a moment, and then the judge declared, this court finds no grounds to proceed with this case further. The charges against Mr. Dre are dismissed. A ripple of shock spread through the room. The prosecutor stood frozen, clearly caught off guard by the judge's decision. Dre remained calm, but the relief was evident in his expression. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long lifted. And for a moment, he allowed himself a small, victorious smile. As he gathered his things to leave the courtroom, reporters surged forward, eager to get his thoughts on the ruling. Mr. Dre, one reporter shouted, how do you feel about the ruling today? Dre paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd of journalists. He knew this moment would define how people saw him, not just as a businessman, but as someone who had successfully navigated the complex legal landscape that could have ruined him. I'm grateful for the court's decision, he said, his voice steady, but today's victory isn't just mine. It's a reminder that fairness in the legal system matters. Businesses need to be able to operate with the confidence that they're not going to be punished for decisions they made in good faith. Based on the laws that were in place at the time, this ruling isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that the law is applied fairly, consistently, and without retroactive consequences. With that, Dre walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. The case was over, but the conversation about the fairness of applying laws retroactively would continue long after the trial had ended.